Welcome back, class, to another lesson in programming in Java. For this lesson, our topic will be our culminating concept, which is Java classes. We've learned so much across our different lessons, including operators, data types, control structures like loops, and branching statements. Of course, we've also learned Boolean expressions, right? And some of those logical operators for those branching statements. And then we've touched upon, since the beginning of class, right? We've touched upon classes, but we're finally going to take a deep dive into classes and how those serve as a blueprint for objects. And then when you put those classes together, of course, you have a broader Java program. So some of the topics we'll be covering today, of course, we'll introduce um, our lesson for today by reviewing some of the previous concepts we covered. We'll talk about objects, and how classes are blueprints for objects. We'll talk about attributes, constructors, methods. These are all members or things we use to define objects and classes. And then, of course, if we want to design a program right, we'll put multiple classes together. We'll talk about which steps you usually take to design those programs. So remember parts of a method. We're going to see this one again. So in the previous lesson, we looked at methods. We briefly looked at the context of methods within a class and how they work with classes. Of course, today we'll take a deep dive. We've been talking about this since the beginning of class, right? A Java program is built and structured into classes because Java is an object-oriented programming language. We represent things in real life as objects, and then those classes are blueprints for those objects. So the classic car example, we have our car, right? And we use variables. We'll learn that those are attributes, right, today, although we've been briefly touching on that vocabulary. So yeah, we use variables to describe attributes or properties of the car. We'll talk about constructors and how they build car objects. And then, of course, methods, right? We took a deep dive last lesson on how methods describe behaviors, right? You can execute multiple lines of code in a method. And when you're talking about classes and objects, those methods, which are called instance methods, those define behaviors. If you're using a static method, it's really not going to be tied to an object. So those belong to the class, not the object. So why do we need a class? Remember, if we put everything in a main, it would become a mess, especially as programs get bigger. And this is the lesson where our programs are going to start to get more complicated. We're not just going to have everything in main like we usually do. We looked at the RPG program example, and these are the different classes, right? Main, weapon, character, battle helper. So the properties, right, are these little minus signs. So weapon might have the name and the damage it inflicts. Character might have a name, health value, level value. They have to carry a weapon, so it makes a reference to the weapon class. And then here's are some of the behaviors for the character, right? You might want to get their name, their stats, level them up. For weapons, I skipped this one. Yeah, it's the you might want to get their name or get the damage. Another one might be like, swing the weapon or attack with the weapon. And then battle helper, these are static methods. So those don't belong to the object, they belong to the class. That's why there's no attributes, right? So we'll talk about that in more detail today. And then, of course, right, here's the design for our RPG program. Character and weapon are instance classes with instance methods. So the object stores data for these important um, real world, right, concepts. Not real world literally, right, but in the sense that they belong to the object. Like I mentioned before, battle helper, a helper class, because it doesn't rely on the object, right? So it's designed for specific tasks. We'll talk about today how that you could use it as a utility class. Sorry. So for like calculations that you need to perform. And then static versus instance methods. We'll talk about the difference in a little bit more detail, but we did cover most of that in the last lesson. And then, of course, we will revisit, right, the rules for calling methods, whether that's from inside the class or outside the class.